Today we are talking Ezra, Levant, Rebel Media, and the seemingly Orwellian state that Canada is quickly becoming. Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and it's the weekend, so it's another car vlog because this is the quietest place I can find. So Ezra, Levant, and Rebel Media are back in the news. You will recall about 3.5 months ago, I did a vlog breaking down the injunction that Rebel Media needed to get in joining the Leaders Debates Commission to accredit Rebel Media to cover the federal debates. The federal election debates for the federal elections in Canada. For those of you who are not Canadian, we had federal elections about 3 months ago. In the context of those elections, there were debates between the leaders of the parties. And there was a government commission that was created specifically for the purposes of putting on those debates. And that commission is called the Leaders Debates Commission. They were created specifically for the purposes of putting on the debates, promoting their popularity, making sure that people had access to information in the context of the federal elections. And in the context of that mandate, the Leaders Debates Commission decides who they give accreditation to for the purposes of covering those debates. And lo and behold, on the Friday before the Monday when the debates were scheduled to occur, the Leaders Debates Commission refused to accredit Rebel Media to cover the debates. Rebel Media immediately petitioned the court for an emergency injunction, which they argued on the Monday of the debate, and they were granted authorization. The court enjoined the Leaders Debates Commission to accredit Rebel Media to cover the debates that Monday evening. Now, I did a vlog breaking down that entire situation. If you haven't seen it yet, I'm going to link it right here. Give it a watch. But the long story short, Rebel Media filed for the injunction. They obtained the injunction enjoining the Leaders Debates Commission to accredit Rebel Media to be able to cover the federal debates. Apparently, Rebel Media incurred something like $18,000 in legal fees to pursue that injunction, whereas the federal government incurred over $130,000 in legal fees to contest the injunction. $130,000 in legal fees for what apparently was a few days in court. I tell you what, it's good to be on a government retainer. And it seems that that defeat may have left a bitter taste in the mouth of Trudeau and his administration, who were re-elected in a minority government in those elections. Indeed, Ezra Levant recently posted a video which appears to be an undercover recording of him being investigated by 2 agents of Elections Canada. And we'll get into that video in a second, but apparently Ezra Levant is under investigation for having written a book and advertised for that book in the context of an election period. And apparently these agents of Elections Canada are investigating as to whether or not Ezra Levant and Rebel Media broke any laws as relates to the Elections Canada Act. Now, what is the Canada Election Act? It is a 2000 law that seeks to limit the amount of advertising that can be spent by interest groups in the context of elections. The validity of the law, which was initially challenged, was upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada. It is a tremendously long and complicated law, and the purpose of this video is not to get into that, save and except for the provisions that relate to what is being accused of Ezra Levant and Rebel Media. Operating on the basis of the 2-page letter that Rebel Media received from the Commissioner of Elections Canada, this is what is being accused of Rebel Media. Dear Mr. Levant, pursuant to subsection 510(2) of the Canada Elections Act, this is to inform you that the Commissioner of Canada Elections has initiated an administrative investigation into allegations that Rebel News Network Limited has contravened sections 352 and 353 of the Act. The allegations are that Rebel News contravened the Act by 1. Failing to include the required information on third-party election advertising, and 2. Having incurred over $500 on election advertising expenses, failing to register as a third party in the 43rd general election. Specifically, it is alleged that Rebel News engaged in election advertising in its production and distribution of Libranos signs during the election period. The conclusion of the administrative investigation may lead the Commissioner of Canada Elections to levy an administrative monetary penalty against Rebel News and or any of its directors or officers to address violations and ensure compliance with the Act. Please note that sections 352 and 353 of the Act state as follows. 352. A third party shall include, in a manner that is clearly visible or otherwise accessible, in any election advertising message placed by its name, its telephone number, either its civic or its internet address, and an indication in or on the message that it has authorized its transmission. A third party shall register immediately after having incurred the following expenses in an aggregate amount of $500. Partisan activity expenses in relation to partisan activities that are carried out during an election period. Election advertising expenses in relation to election advertising messages that are transmitted during that period, and election survey expenses in relation to election surveys that are conducted during that period. And here's where it gets interesting. As you may be aware, the definition of election advertising in the Act contains examples of some communications that could promote or oppose a registered party or a candidate, but that do not constitute election advertising. Among these examples is one that applies to, quote, the promotion of the sale of a book if the book was planned to be made available to the public regardless of whether there was to be an election. All right, so Ezra Levant receives this letter and then decides to meet with the 2 administrative investigators who are conducting this investigation in Ottawa. He decides to meet with them unrepresented in the Elections Canada federal office for the purposes of being asked a few questions. He does this and secretly records the entire meeting despite the fact that they apparently apparently told him not to record it, and then posts it online afterwards. Now, Ezra Levant has given a number of reasons why he did this, and you may or may not agree with them, but it does raise some very interesting questions. Now, I don't want to give anybody any ideas, but secretly recording conversations is not always the greatest idea. In the States, you need to know if you are recording a conversation in a one-party or two-party consent state. Some states will allow people to secretly record conversations even if the other party does not know, whereas other states will require all parties to consent to the recording. And secretly recording a conversation without the consent of the person that you are recording in a two-party consent state is, in fact, illegal. Now, in Canada, generally speaking, you are allowed recording a conversation even if the other party does not know that you are recording them. But there can be, and in fact are, certain restrictions or exceptions to that rule that can make it extremely dangerous to record conversations without advising the other person. The fact that Ezra Levant is doing this in a federal building with federal agents after they told him not to do it, it's not something I would advise one of my clients to do, but I take for granted that Ezra Levant sought legal advice before deciding to do it. And I know a ton of you out there are going to love it because without the video recording, we could not see the absolute Orwellian state of that meeting. But it is potentially dangerous, and whenever clients ask me if they can record a conversation, I say be careful because oftentimes those things can come back to bite you in the butt. It can come back to bite you in the butt potentially for legal reasons, but also for strategic reasons. People don't really appreciate this, but when they are secretly recording a conversation, it tends to change their behavior. They might say things or do things that they would not otherwise say or do if they were not recording the meeting. And I can tell you that in law, when someone tries to present a secret recording to a judge, the judges typically don't like it. They don't like it, and they start to ask questions about the type of person who would go around secretly recording conversations with others. All right, now setting all of that aside, you have weighed your options and you have decided to make the recording nonetheless. What now? I think it's a very big strategic mistake to let that cat out of the bag and disclose to the world that you have that secret recording. Ezra Levant was angling it to the effect that I have to publish this video because otherwise you will never believe what happened in this meeting. But I actually don't think he needed to publish the video in order for people to believe what happened in that meeting, and now by having published that video, he let the investigators know that he recorded that conversation. If Ezra Levant is my client, I might have advised him to hold on to that recording, not disclose the fact that he has it, and see if the investigators are going to say something that would deny what he has video evidence of. Come out and describe in your own words what happened in that meeting, and give the investigators a chance to deny something that you can later disprove with that video. But now he has just played the ace that he had in the hole, and he's got nothing more to surprise them with. He's got nothing more to surprise them with, and he's got nothing more to set them up with. Now, I am not including any clips from that video. If you want to watch it, I'm going to link it right here. Go ahead. But as far as that meeting goes, I don't know if it's Orwellian or Kafkaesque, but one thing is for certain, it's scary to watch. Marcus Tullius Cicero wisely wrote, "More laws, less justice." And listening to what Rebel Media is being accused of, one can totally understand the wisdom of these words. There is a law that the government created. It's called the Canada Election Act. That law creates certain prohibitions. Some of those prohibitions relate to third-party expenses on political advertising in an election period. Agree or disagree with it, we elected officials who passed that law, and the Supreme Court of Canada confirmed the constitutionality of that law. And now the full force of that law is being brought down on a journalist in circumstances that can only be described as suspect. And I know what you're all saying. There was an exception provided for in the law. Why are we not talking about that? Let's talk about that exception. Election advertising means the transmission to the public by any means during an election period of an advertising message that promotes or opposes a registered party or the election of a candidate, including by taking a position on an issue with which a registered party or candidate is associated. For greater certainty, it does not include B, the distribution of a book or the promotion of the sale of a book for no less than its commercial value if the book was planned to be made available to the public regardless of whether there was to be an election. More law, less justice. This law provides for an exception of books insofar as the books were going to be published anyhow, notwithstanding the fact that there was to be an election. And so we can see that the law as drafted requires mind reading of sorts in order to determine whether or not the author was going to publish the book regardless of whether or not there was an election. And so now you get these government agents who are exercising their authority under the law to divine whether or not Ezra Levant was going to publish that book anyhow. And it gives them power now to subpoena documents, to investigate, to determine whether or not that book was going to be published regardless of the elections. And also the law as drafted creates an exception for advertising for the promotion of the book, but not for political advertising. So someone can still say that this advertising is not for the promotion of the book, but rather political advertising. Or the law creates an exception that is so subjective that it's only going to apply to people that you like, but it won't apply to people that you don't like. More law, less justice. What makes this situation so shocking is that it is entirely legal. These agents are empowered to do what they're doing under the law. The commission referred to the exceptions under the law in their letter to Ezra Levant, but those exceptions are absolutely illusory. All right, so there's an exception for a book if that book was going to be published regardless of whether or not there was going to be an election. How does anyone prove that? In fact, you know what? More important than how one proves that is the investigative powers that gives to the commissioner. Now, in their investigation, in order to prove a violation of the Canada Election Act, they get to subpoena documents, ask ask for testimony, question everybody on whether or not that book was going to be published regardless of whether or not there was going to be an election. Typically, that's the exact time that you want to publish a book, when there is going to be an election. And not just that, but as relates to the subjectivity, when does an ad to promote the book become a political ad? If the book is critical of one of the parties and the ad promotes the book, is that not a political ad by definition? And is it not sufficiently murky of a question to render that exception effectively obsolete? The reality is that I can anticipate the argument by the commissioner that Ezra, Levant and Rebel Media did in fact violate the terms of the Canada Election Act. The fact that that might be illegal in the first place is a problem. The fact that it would bestow onto this agency massive investigative powers is even more of a problem. One does not have to have a creative imagination to see how this power can be abused for political purposes. More power, less justice, and the sun has set and this car is getting humid, so it's time to wind this up. If you like my videos and you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, drop a comment in the comment section below because it feeds the algorithm. If you want to support my channel, merch links, PayPal link is in the pinned comment. You can get some good merch. Nothing says love like wearing a Vlog Dog shirt and posting a picture to social. I will be following the story closely. If Ezra Levant wants to do a live stream where we can ask some questions and dive into this deeper, I would love to do that. But I definitely suspect this story is not yet over. It is going places, and when it goes places, I will be there, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Booyah!